Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel.
Bye, guys. So happy to have you here again today with us.
Okay, today's topic is one of the most emotionally frustrating experiences in the entire language learning journey, the plateau.
That specific feeling where you've clearly made real progress, you're past the beginner stage, but suddenly, for weeks, sometimes months, nothing seems to be improving at all, no matter how much you study.
And it's genuinely one of the most common reasons people quit, right in the middle of the journey, often frustratingly close to a real breakthrough they never got to see.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Emma.
And I'm David, and today we're breaking down exactly why plateaus happen, and more importantly, exactly how to break through one.
Let's start with why plateaus happen at all, because I think understanding the mechanism actually helps a lot with the emotional side of dealing with one.
Sure, so early on in language learning, progress feels incredibly fast. Every single day you're learning brand new words, brand new grammar structures, and the improvement is obvious and immediate.
Right, going from zero to basic conversation feels like enormous visible progress because almost everything is new information.
But once you reach an intermediate level, the remaining gaps become smaller, more subtle, and much harder to notice improving day to day. You're not learning entirely new grammar anymore, you're refining nuance, tone, and less common vocabulary.
And refinement, by its nature, feels invisible in the short term, even though it's genuinely happening underneath the surface the whole time.
So the plateau isn't actually a sign that learning has stopped, it's usually a sign that the type of learning has shifted, from big, obvious leaps to small, quiet, harder to notice improvements.
Which is such an important reframe because emotionally, a plateau feels like failure, like something's broken, when biologically and cognitively, it's actually a completely normal, expected stage of the process.
Let's talk about the specific psychological experience of being on a plateau, because I think naming it clearly helps a lot of people feel less alone in it.
The most common feeling is this frustrating mix of I'm working just as hard as before, but nothing seems to be changing, which creates real doubt about whether the effort is even worth continuing.
And that doubt is dangerous, because it's exactly the point where a lot of people quit, right as the underlying groundwork for the next breakthrough is quietly being built.
There's actually a concept from complex systems and learning science that applies really well here, sometimes called the iceberg effect of skill development. Visible progress sits above the surface, but a huge amount of underlying neural and pattern recognition development happens invisibly below it first.
Meaning the breakthrough that eventually happened didn't come out of nowhere. It was built during the plateau, through all that invisible underlying development, even though it didn't feel like progress in the moment.
So the plateau isn't wasted time, it's actually the necessary groundwork phase, even though it emotionally feels like the opposite.
Let's get into the specific causes of plateaus now, because there isn't just one single reason. There are usually several overlapping factors.
Cause number one, and probably the most common, comfortable repetition. You've built a routine that got you from beginner to intermediate, and you keep doing that exact same routine even though it's no longer challenging enough to produce new growth.
This happens constantly. The same level of podcast, the same type of vocabulary app deck, the same conversation topics with the same practice partner, all of which were genuinely useful early on but have become too comfortable to keep producing improvement.
Right, your brain adapts to a consistent level of challenge fairly quickly. And once material stops being in that stretch zone we've talked about before, growth naturally slows down significantly.
Cause number two, narrow input variety. A lot of intermediate learners settle into one specific type of content, one accent, one topic area, one register of formality, and stop being exposed to anything outside that narrow range.
Which creates a very solid, comfortable competence within that narrow lane, but almost no growth outside it. So real-world conversations that fall outside that familiar range feel disproportionately difficult.
Cause number three, and this one's a bit more subtle. Avoiding your actual weak points. Most intermediate learners have specific known weaknesses. Certain tenses, certain types of listening material, certain conversation topics, and unconsciously avoid practicing exactly those weak areas because they're the most uncomfortable to practice.
which means all your practice time reinforces what you're already good at, and the genuine weak points never actually get addressed, because avoiding discomfort feels more pleasant in the moment than confronting it directly.
Cause number 4. Burnout and reduced consistency without you necessarily noticing it happening. A lot of learners unconsciously reduce the intensity or frequency of their practice once the initial excitement fades, without consciously deciding to slow down.
It's rarely a dramatic, sudden stop. It's more of a slow drift. 10 minutes instead of 30, 3 days a week instead of daily. And that quiet reduction alone can produce a plateau, completely separate from any of the other causes.
So, plateaus usually aren't caused by one single issue. They're caused by some combination of comfortable repetition, narrow input variety, avoiding weak points, and quietly reduced consistency, all compounding together.
There's actually a fifth cause worth mentioning too, one that's a bit more emotional than mechanical: plateau anxiety itself becoming self-reinforcing. The stress of feeling stuck actually makes learning harder in the moment, which then produces more evidence that supports the feeling of being stuck in a genuinely vicious cycle.
Right. Stress and anxiety measurably reduce working memory capacity and the ability to absorb new information. So, the emotional experience of "I'm stuck and it's stressing me out" can actually become part of the mechanism keeping you stuck, not just a reaction to it.
Which means part of breaking a plateau sometimes isn't purely about changing your study method at all. It's about reducing the anxiety around the plateau itself first, so your brain has the actual cognitive bandwidth available to absorb new patterns again.
That's such an important addition because a lot of advice around plateaus focuses purely on mechanics, harder material, more variety, and skips over the fact that the emotional state you're in while studying genuinely affects how much of that studying actually sticks.
Let's move into the actual solutions now, because I think this is what everyone watching genuinely wants. How do you actually break?
Solution 1. Directly addressing comfortable repetition. Deliberately increase difficulty in a structured way, rather than staying in the same comfortable material indefinitely.
This means actively seeking out content that's noticeably harder than what feels comfortable right now, even if it produces that uncomfortable feeling of understanding maybe 60 or 70% instead of 90%.
Which feels counterintuitive because comfortable material feels more pleasant in the moment. But that exact discomfort is a signal that you're back in a genuine growth zone, rather than a maintenance zone.
Solution 2. Directly addressing narrow input variety. Deliberately diversify your content across accents, topics, and formality levels on purpose, even if it feels a little chaotic compared to your previous routine.
If you've only been listening to one specific type of podcast, add a completely different accent, a completely different topic area, even a different genre entirely. Comedy instead of news, formal interviews instead of casual chats.
The goal is exposing yourself to the full range of real-world English, rather than one comfortable, narrow slice of it, because plateaus often hide specifically in the areas you've been unconsciously avoiding.
Solution 3, and this is the one that requires the most courage, honestly. Directly confront your specific known weak points on purpose rather than avoiding them.
Make a genuinely honest list. What tenses trip you up? What accents confuse you? What topics make you freeze in conversation? And then deliberately build a portion of your practice specifically targeting those exact weak areas.
It's uncomfortable by design, but this is usually where the fastest, most noticeable breakthroughs actually come from, precisely because that ground hasn't been covered yet.
Solution 4, addressing quiet consistency drift. Do an honest audit of your actual current practice. Not what you assume you're doing, but what you're genuinely doing day to day, this week specifically.
A lot of people are shocked when they actually track it honestly. What felt like still practicing regularly turns out to be 2 or 3 short sessions a week, quietly reduced from a daily habit that used to exist months earlier.
Once you see the honest gap, you can consciously rebuild the consistency, rather than staying in denial about a drift that happened so gradually it went unnoticed.
Let's talk about a fifth solution too, one that's a little different from the others. Deliberately changing your goal structure during a plateau, shifting from vague, big picture goals towards small, specific, measurable challenges.
Instead of the vague goal, become fluent, which is basically impossible to measure day to day, and therefore impossible to feel progress toward, set something narrow and specific, like have one full 5-minute conversation this week entirely about my job, or understand an entire unscripted podcast episode without subtitles.
Small, specific, achievable targets create visible, checkable wins during exactly the period when progress otherwise feels completely invisible, which helps enormously with the emotional side of pushing through a plateau.
And let's add a sixth solution directly tied to that anxiety cycle we mentioned earlier. Deliberately lowering the emotional stakes of individual practice sessions during a plateau specifically.
Meaning, instead of treating each session as a test of whether you're still improving, which creates exactly the anxiety loop we talked about, you reframe each session as simple, low pressure exposure and maintenance. Nothing needs to be proven in any single sitting.
Because once the anxiety around each session drops, the cognitive bandwidth for actually absorbing new patterns tends to come back naturally, which often kickstarts visible progress again, sometimes surprisingly quickly.
Let's talk about the emotional side a bit more directly too, because I don't think the practical solutions alone fully address how genuinely discouraging a plateau feels while you're inside it. Completely agree. One thing that helps a lot of learners we've talked to is simply knowing ahead of time that plateaus are universal expected parts of the process, not a personal sign of failure or lack of talent.
Almost everyone who's ever become fluent in a second language has gone through multiple plateaus along the way, sometimes lasting weeks, sometimes several months. And the people who eventually broke through weren't necessarily more talented, they simply kept showing up through the uncomfortable, invisible middle section.
Which connects back to something we've said in previous videos. Consistency through the boring, unrewarding middle matters so much more than raw talent or motivation at the very beginning.
I actually remember a stretch like this really clearly from my own experience learning a second language years ago. There was a period of almost 3 months where I genuinely felt like I was going backward, not just stuck.
What did that actually feel like day to day?
Conversations that used to feel manageable suddenly felt exhausting again. I remember specifically thinking I'd somehow lost ground I'd already gained, which felt so much worse than simply not improving.
And what actually happened after that 3-month stretch?
Almost overnight, within about 2 weeks, things clicked in a way that felt sudden, but looking back, obviously wasn't actually sudden at all. It was clearly the result of everything I'd been quietly absorbing during those 3 frustrating months.
That lines up so well with everything we've described today, the iceberg effect. Invisible groundwork happening below the surface the whole time, even though it genuinely felt like regression in the moment.
Which is exactly why I think it's worth sharing honestly, because in that moment, I had no way of knowing a breakthrough was actually close. It just felt like failure. And a lot of people quit exactly there, right before that quiet groundwork pays off.
Let's talk about tracking specifically, because I think this is one of the most practical tools for surviving a plateau emotionally, not just fixing it mechanically.
Keep an old recording of yourself speaking, an old piece of writing from 2 or 3 months earlier, and periodically compare it honestly to where you are now, rather than comparing today to yesterday, which shows almost nothing.
Because month-to-month comparison usually reveals real, measurable progress even during a plateau. Progress that's simply too gradual to notice on a day-to-day timescale.
That comparison alone often provides enough proof of real progress to keep going through the discouraging middle section, rather than quitting right before a breakthrough that was already quietly building underneath the surface.
Let's do a quick recap of the whole framework before we wrap up, because there's a lot to hold on to here.
Plateaus happen because of comfortable repetition, narrow input variety, avoiding known weak points, and quietly reduced consistency, usually some combination of all 4 working together.
And you break through by deliberately increasing difficulty, diversifying your input, confronting your specific weak points directly, honestly auditing your actual consistency, and shifting towards small, specific, measurable goals during the plateau itself.
And underneath all of that, the biggest emotional shift is understanding that a plateau isn't evidence that something's wrong. It's usually evidence that invisible groundwork is being laid for the next breakthrough.
If you're in a plateau right now, genuinely, that discomfort you're feeling is normal, and it doesn't mean you should quit. It usually means you're closer to a breakthrough than it feels like from the inside.
Let us know in the comments if you're currently stuck on a plateau and which one of today's solutions you're going to try first this week.
We read every comment, and honestly, knowing how many of you are going through this exact same frustration helps us keep making videos that actually address what people are struggling with in real life.
And honestly, if this video gave you even one thing to think about differently, the single most helpful thing you can do for us is hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because every follow genuinely helps this channel keep growing.
The more of you who support us by subscribing, liking, and sharing this with someone who's stuck on their own plateau right now, the more resources we have to keep making deeper, more thoughtful videos like this one, instead of shallow, recycled tips you've already heard 100 times.
So if you believe in what we're building here, take 2 seconds right now, hit subscribe, tap that bell, and consider sharing this with a friend who's struggling with their own English journey. It genuinely makes a difference, and it's the reason we're able to keep this going.
Thank you so much for being here, for real. We'll see you in the next one.